At 80 years old, I decided to move out and live alone, and it was the best decision I ever made. Howard Finch stood outside his new apartment, a small one-bedroom unit in a rundown building on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. The air was crisp, the wind biting through his thin coat. At his feet was a single battered suitcase, all that he had brought with him after leaving his son's house. Inside, the walls were bare, the floor scuffed, and the room echoed with emptiness. But to Howard, it felt like the first breath of freedom he'd taken in years. Howard closed his eyes, the memory of the last argument with his son still fresh. "You don't get to decide anything here anymore, Dad," his son had said, voice cold and sharp. Howard swallowed, his jaw clenched. For decades, he had put everyone else's needs above his own. But now, for the first time, he was choosing himself, even if it meant starting over with nothing. Howard Finch sat alone in the center of his nearly empty apartment, the silence pressing down like a thick, suffocating fog. The walls were a dull, lifeless gray, and the only furniture in the room was a worn-out recliner he had dragged up the stairs himself. Beside it was a small table where a single lamp cast a dim, flickering light, barely enough to illuminate the small space. He leaned back, his body sinking into the chair with a tired groan. The apartment was cold, the kind of cold that crept into his bones and settled there, a chilling reminder that he was alone. Completely and utterly alone. Howard closed his eyes, and his mind drifted back to the house he had just left behind, the place he once called home. It had been his home for over a decade, ever since his wife June passed away. He had moved in with his son David, thinking it would be a temporary arrangement, just until he could get back on his feet. But time had a way of slipping through his fingers, and the days turned into weeks, then months, then years. And in those years, Howard lost more than just a sense of time. He lost his voice. In the beginning, David welcomed him with open arms. They sat together at the dinner table, sharing stories, laughing over old memories, and reminiscing about June's cooking. The house was filled with warmth and chatter, the sound of his grandchildren playing in the living room, the scent of fresh coffee wafting from the kitchen. But gradually, things began to change. David got a promotion, a big one. Suddenly, he was too busy to sit down for dinner. Meetings, business trips, and late nights became the norm. Howard spent more and more time alone in his room, eating reheated meals, while David and his wife, Linda, entertained guests downstairs. Linda's demeanor toward Howard changed too. She used to ask him for advice, on gardening, on cooking, even on the children. But now, she only asked him for favors. "Can you pick up the kids from school, Howard? Can you make dinner tonight, Howard? Can you keep the kids quiet? David has an important call." Howard did everything she asked, never once complaining. After all, what else was he there for? His days became a monotonous cycle of chores and errands, his only purpose to keep things running smoothly for a family that no longer seemed to notice he was there. The day he overheard Linda on the phone was the day everything changed. He had been passing by the kitchen when he heard her hushed voice. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," she said. "David won't admit it, but having his father here is too much. It's like we have a permanent babysitter, and he's always underfoot, meddling, getting in the way. I just wish he'd understand that this isn't his house anymore." The words hit Howard like a punch to the gut. He backed away from the door, his heart pounding. Had he become a burden? Had he overstayed his welcome? Later that night, he brought it up with David. He tried to keep his voice steady, tried not to let the hurt show. But David's response was as sharp and cutting as Linda's words. "Dad, you have to understand," David said, barely looking up from his phone. "You can't just do whatever you want around here. This is our house. You don't get to decide how things work anymore." Howard's heart sank. There it was. The truth he had been trying so hard to ignore. He was no longer the man of the house. He was no longer the father who commanded respect, the husband who was needed and loved. He was just there, a shadow, a ghost of who he once was. That night, Howard lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the bed, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. And that's when he made the decision to leave. To walk away from the house that no longer felt like home. To find a place where he could breathe, where he could remember who he was before he became just another mouth to feed, another set of hands to put to work. Now, as he sat alone in the cold, empty apartment, Howard wondered if he had made a mistake. The silence was deafening. There was no sound of children playing, no clinking of dishes from the kitchen, no soft hum of the television in the background. Just silence. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the suitcase that still sat by the door. Inside were his clothes, a few old photographs, and a book of crossword puzzles June had given him years ago. It was all he had brought with him, all he had left. Howard leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. The loneliness pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. What had he expected? That by leaving, he would suddenly feel free. That the world would open up to him, ready to embrace him with open arms. But instead, he felt more isolated than ever. The walls of the apartment loomed around him, cold and unwelcoming. He was 80 years old, and for the first time in his life, he was truly on his own. He thought about calling David, thought about picking up the phone and telling him he had made a mistake, that he couldn't do this, that he wasn't strong enough, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Because deep down, Howard knew that going back would mean admitting that he was powerless, that he was as useless and insignificant as they made him feel, and he couldn't do that. Not again. Howard forced himself to stand, his knees creaking, his body heavy and slow. He crossed the room to the window, the floorboards groaning beneath his feet. Outside, the street was empty, the sidewalks wet from the rain. A lone car passed by, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Howard pressed his forehead against the cool glass, his breath fogging up the window. Somewhere out there, life was moving on without him. People were laughing, working, loving, living. And he was here, trapped in a room that felt more like a holding cell than a home. But as he stood there, staring out at the empty street, a thought crossed his mind. A small, quiet thought that took root and refused to let go. Maybe this emptiness wasn't a prison. Maybe it was a blank slate. Maybe it was a chance to start over. Howard pulled away from the window, his spine straightening. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs, his chest expanding. He had made the decision to leave for a reason. He had walked away to find himself. To remember who he was, who he could be, without a family to serve, without a role to play. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to find out. Howard Finch awoke to the sound of rain tapping against the window. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, but in the emptiness of the apartment, it felt deafening. He lay still for a moment, staring up at the ceiling, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. His body ached. A dull, persistent ache that came from too many years of bending and lifting, of fixing engines and hauling heavy tools. His old life. The life he once knew. Howard sat up slowly, the mattress creaking beneath him. He glanced around the room. The gray light from outside seeped in through the blinds, casting long, thin shadows that stretched across the bare walls. The apartment was as empty as it had been the night before. A single chair, a small table, the suitcase by the door. Howard's eyes drifted to the suitcase. It was still packed. He hadn't even bothered to unpack it. Why would he? What was the point? He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet touching the cold floor. The chill shot up his legs, a sharp reminder that he was truly alone. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering slightly, then pushed himself up to his feet. His knees creaked, his back protested, but he kept moving. Step by step, he shuffled to the small kitchenette. A chipped coffee mug sat on the counter, along with a can of instant coffee he had picked up at the corner store. Howard filled the mug with water, set it in the microwave, and watched as the cup slowly rotated inside. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. Howard leaned against the counter, his hands gripping the edge. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he was back in David's kitchen. The sound of bacon sizzling, the smell of fresh coffee, the chatter of his grandchildren's voices echoing through the house. But that was gone now. That life was behind him. The microwave beeped, snapping Howard back to the present. He opened the door, carefully lifted the mug, and set it down on the counter. He reached for the can of instant coffee, spooned a small amount into the mug, and stirred. The coffee was bitter, almost undrinkable, but Howard sipped it anyway. He needed something to fill the silence. Something to keep his hands busy, his mind distracted. Outside, the rain continued to fall, the droplets streaming down the window like tiny rivers. Howard stood by the glass, the mug warm in his hands. He watched as people hurried down the sidewalk, umbrellas bobbing like colorful mushrooms in the gray, drizzly morning. Across the street, a woman was walking her dog, a small, scruffy terrier that trotted along beside her, its leash dragging in the puddles. The woman's hair was wet, her coat soaked through, but she was smiling, talking to the dog as if it were a dear friend. Howard's gaze followed her until she disappeared around the corner. Then the street was empty again, and the world fell silent. He turned away from the window, his eyes landing on the suitcase. Maybe it was time to unpack. Maybe it was time to accept that this was his life now. 4 walls, a chair, a bed, and a suitcase full of memories he couldn't bring himself to look at. Howard knelt down beside the suitcase, his knees popping as he bent. He unzipped it, the sound loud in the quiet room. Inside were neatly folded shirts, a few pairs of pants, some socks and underwear. At the bottom was a framed photograph wrapped in a soft, worn towel. Howard's hands trembled as he pulled it out. He unwrapped the towel carefully, revealing the photograph. A black and white picture of himself and June on their wedding day. She was beaming, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes bright and full of life. Howard stood beside her, his arm around her waist, his smile wide and genuine. That was the man he used to be. A man with purpose. A man with love in his life. A man who had someone to come home to. Howard traced the outline of June's face with his thumb, his eyes stinging. How long had it been since he had felt truly seen? Since someone had looked at him the way June used to. He set the photograph on the table, propping it up against the coffee can. It was the only thing in the room that felt real, the only reminder of the life he once had. Howard stood, his joints creaking, and walked to the closet. Inside was a coat, his old leather jacket, the one he hadn't worn in years. He slipped it on, the familiar weight of it grounding him, reminding him that he was still here, still alive. He grabbed his keys, slipped them into his pocket, and stepped out into the hallway. The building was old, the walls stained and peeling, the carpet frayed and smelling of mildew. A television blared somewhere down the hall, the sound of a game show host announcing a prize, the audience cheering in response. Howard shuffled down the stairs, his hand gripping the railing. Outside, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle, the air cool and damp. The street was mostly empty, a few cars parked along the curb, their windshields fogged. Howard pulled his collar up against the chill and started walking. He had no destination in mind, just the need to keep moving, to feel the ground beneath his feet, to remind himself that he still existed. A few blocks away, he came to a small park. It wasn't much, just a patch of grass with a few benches and a couple of tired-looking trees. But to Howard, it felt like an oasis in the middle of the gray, lifeless neighborhood. He sat down on a bench, the wood damp and cold against his legs. Across the park, a young couple sat together under a tree, their heads close, their hands intertwined. They laughed softly, their voices mingling with the sound of the rain. Howard watched them, his chest tightening. He had once been that man, the man who held June's hand, who whispered jokes that only she would understand. He had once been part of something, someone. Now, he was just a man on a bench, watching life pass him by. The young couple stood, laughing as they ran off through the rain. The park was empty again, the silence settling like a heavy fog. Howard leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. What now? What did he do now? He had spent decades living for others, first for June, then for David and Linda. Every decision he had made had been for them. But now, there was no one left to make decisions for, just himself. Howard's eyes drifted to the small coffee shop across the street, a run-down little place with a faded sign and a neon open light flickering in the window. It wasn't much, but it was somewhere to go. Somewhere that wasn't this empty park, this empty apartment, this empty life. Howard pushed himself to his feet, his knees groaning in protest. He zipped up his coat, took a deep breath, and started walking toward the cafe. It was time to do something. Time to go somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, time to start living for himself. Howard Finch stood at the entrance of the small coffee shop, the faint smell of burnt coffee and sugar wafting through the air. The sign above the door flickered, one bulb sputtering weakly before giving out completely. The interior was dimly lit, with mismatched chairs and tables scattered haphazardly. He hesitated, his hand resting on the door handle. The glass was fogged up, a few droplets from the rain streaking down the surface. Inside, a couple sat at the counter, their heads bowed together, speaking in hushed tones. An older man sat alone in the corner, staring blankly at the steam rising from his cup. Howard took a deep breath, feeling the cold air bite through his jacket. It was just a coffee shop, a simple place. But to Howard, it felt like a test of whether he could truly step outside the walls he had built around himself for so many years. With a final, deep breath, he pushed the door open. The bell above the door chimed, and the barista behind the counter looked up, offering a tired but polite smile. "Morning," she said, her eyes quickly shifting back to the coffee machine. Howard shuffled inside, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. The warmth hit him instantly, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. He scanned the room, feeling the eyes of the other patrons graze over him, before quickly looking away. A few seats were available. A stool at the counter, a booth in the back, a small table near the window. Howard chose the window, dropping his coat onto the back of the chair before sinking down onto the seat. The table was sticky, and the chair wobbled beneath him, but it was fine. It was enough. A few minutes later, the barista approached, a notepad in hand. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark circles under her eyes and hair pulled into a messy bun. "What can I get you?" she asked, her pen poised above the paper. Howard cleared his throat, his voice rough and unused. "Just coffee, black." She nodded, scribbling something down. "Coming right up." Howard watched as she walked away, his gaze drifting to the other patrons. The couple at the counter were still whispering to each other, their hands entwined. The older man in the corner continued to stare at his cup, eyes vacant, shoulders slumped. Howard's gaze fell to his own hands, fingers twisting together in his lap. He felt like an intruder here, a man out of place, a man without a purpose. He wondered if the old man in the corner felt the same. The barista returned a few minutes later, setting the mug down with a soft clink. "Here you go," she said, offering another weak smile before turning away. Howard stared at the coffee, the steam rising in slow, lazy curls. It was dark, almost black, the surface trembling slightly as he lifted the mug to his lips. The coffee was bitter and scalding, burning the back of his throat. But it was warm. It was something to hold on to. As he sipped, his eyes drifted to the window. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets wet and gleaming under the gray sky. People walked by, umbrellas dripping, shoes splashing through puddles. Life moved on, as it always did. But Howard remained still, stuck in place, a man without direction, without purpose. He set the mug down, the warmth seeping into his palms. Across the room, the old man in the corner suddenly stood, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. Howard watched as the man shuffled toward the door, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. For a moment, Howard considered calling out to him, saying something, anything. But what would he say? What could he possibly offer to a stranger when he couldn't even figure out his own life? The man left, the bell above the door chiming again, the sound lingering in the empty air. Howard returned his gaze to the table, his hands tightening around the mug. He thought about June, about how she used to make coffee every morning, always too strong, always too bitter. But she would stand there in the kitchen, hands wrapped around her mug, eyes half closed as she sipped. "It's awful," she'd say, scrunching up her nose. "But it wakes me up." Howard would laugh, take the mug from her hands, and finish the rest. "You never could make a decent cup of coffee," he'd tease, and she'd swat at him with a dish towel, laughing along. That laughter echoed in his mind now, a ghostly memory that lingered in the corners of the room. He closed his eyes, letting it wash over him, feeling the ache of her absence press down like a weight on his chest. When he opened his eyes, the cafe was emptier. The couple had left, and only the barista remained, wiping down the counter with slow, deliberate strokes. Howard set the mug down, the coffee now cold. He pushed it away, his hands falling to his lap. What was he doing here? What had he expected to find? The bell above the door chimed again, and a gust of cold air swept through the room. Howard glanced up, and his heart gave a small, unexpected jolt. A woman had entered, older, around his age, with silver hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She wore a long beige coat, her hands tucked into the pockets, eyes scanning the room. Howard watched as she moved to the counter, leaning forward to speak to the barista. Her voice was soft, her smile warm, and when she laughed, it was a light, melodic sound that carried through the room. Howard couldn't take his eyes off her. There was something about her, something familiar, something comforting. Maybe it was the way she smiled, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the way she seemed completely at ease, completely herself. The barista handed her a cup of coffee, and the woman turned, scanning the room. Her eyes met Howard's, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. She nodded, a polite, friendly gesture, before moving to a table near the window. Howard's heart hammered against his ribs, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. What now? Should he say something? Should he get up, walk over, introduce himself? But what would he say? Hi, I'm Howard Finch. I'm 80 years old and completely alone in the world. No, that wouldn't do. Howard lowered his eyes to the table, his fingers tracing a crack in the wood. He could feel her presence across the room, could hear the soft clink of her spoon against the mug as she stirred her coffee. He wanted to speak, wanted to reach out, wanted to say, Hi, I'm Howard. I used to be someone. I used to have a life. I used to know who I was. But instead, he remained silent, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes fixed on the empty mug in front of him. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a weak, pale sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting soft, golden light over the wet streets. Howard watched as the woman took a slow, thoughtful sip of her coffee, her eyes gazing out the window. Maybe tomorrow he would say something. Maybe tomorrow he would find the courage. But for now, he just sat there, the words lodged in his throat, the world moving on without him. The days that followed blurred together like wet ink on a crumpled page. Howard Finch spent most of his time in the small apartment, the walls pressing in closer with each passing hour. Outside, the world continued to move, cars humming by, pedestrians shuffling down the sidewalk with heads bowed against the cold. Inside, Howard sat in his single creaky chair, staring at the photograph of June. Her smile, frozen in time, seemed to taunt him. She looked so happy, so full of life, a life that had ended far too soon. Howard's fingers traced the edge of the frame, his thumb running over the glass, as if he could somehow feel her warmth, her presence. But all he felt was the cold, hard surface, a reminder that she was gone, and he was still here. Still alone. The coffee shop had become his refuge. Each morning, he walked the 2 blocks to the shop, hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the ground. He'd slip inside, nod to the barista, and take his usual seat by the window. He never said much. Just ordered his coffee, black, no sugar, and sat there, staring out the window, watching people pass by. He wondered where they were going, what they were rushing toward, what they had to look forward to. But Howard had nowhere to go, nothing to look forward to. Just another day in a string of endless, empty days. One afternoon, as Howard sat nursing his second cup of coffee, the door chimed. He glanced up, and there she was, the woman with the silver hair and the soft, melodic laugh. She stepped inside, shaking the rain from her coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Howard's heart gave a small, unexpected jolt. He watched as she ordered her coffee, the barista greeting her with a warm smile. Hey Maggie, the usual. Maggie. Her name was Maggie. Howard leaned forward, his hands wrapped around the mug, the warmth seeping into his palms. He couldn't take his eyes off her. There was something about the way she moved, the way she carried herself. Confident, but unassuming, graceful, but grounded. Maggie took her coffee and glanced around the room. Her eyes met Howard's, and she gave a polite, fleeting smile before moving to the table by the window. The same table she always chose. Howard swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He could speak to her. He could get up, walk over, say hello. It would be simple, just a few words, a brief introduction. But his legs felt heavy, rooted to the floor. The words stayed trapped in his throat, and he lowered his gaze to the table, his fingers drumming nervously against the mug. Hours passed. Maggie stayed, her notebook open in front of her, pen moving swiftly across the page. Howard couldn't help but steal glances at her, watching as her brows furrowed, her lips pursed in concentration. What was she writing? Was it a letter? A journal? A story? Howard tried to remember the last time he had written anything. Maybe a birthday card to David, years ago. Or a grocery list for Linda. Milk, eggs, bread. But writing just for the sake of it. No. That was something he had never done. Maggie suddenly sat back, letting out a soft sigh. She closed the notebook, capped her pen, and took a long, slow sip of her coffee. For a moment, she just sat there, staring out the window, her eyes distant and unfocused. Howard wondered what she was thinking, what memories she was sifting through. Then, as if feeling his gaze, she turned and looked at him. Howard's heart skipped a beat. He quickly dropped his eyes, focusing intently on the coffee mug as if it held the secrets to the universe. He felt her gaze linger, just for a second, before she stood, collected her things, and left. The bell chimed, and just like that, she was gone. That night, Howard lay in bed, the room bathed in darkness. Outside, a car alarm blared, its shrill, piercing sound echoing through the empty streets. Howard pressed a pillow over his ears, trying to block it out, but the noise seemed to grow louder, drilling into his skull. His mind drifted to Maggie, her soft, gentle smile, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way her eyes seemed to hold so many untold stories. Howard closed his eyes, and in the darkness, he imagined himself sitting across from her, notebook open, pen poised above the page. What would he write? What would he say? The next morning, Howard walked to the coffee shop, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold air bit at his skin, the wind cutting through his thin coat like a knife. But he kept walking, one foot in front of the other, driven by something he couldn't quite name. When he entered, the shop was mostly empty. The barista glanced up, nodded. "Morning, Howard." Howard nodded back, his eyes scanning the room. Maggie wasn't there. Her usual table by the window sat empty, the chair pulled out slightly, as if waiting for her return. Howard's shoulders slumped, a pang of disappointment twisting in his gut. He shuffled to the counter, ordered his coffee, and took his seat by the window. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling heavier than the last. Howard sipped his coffee, the warmth doing little to thaw the chill that had settled deep in his bones. It was nearly noon when the door chimed. Howard glanced up, and there she was, Maggie, her silver hair slightly tousled by the wind, her cheeks flushed pink. She carried a small canvas bag slung over her shoulder, and as she stepped inside, she paused, her eyes scanning the room. For a brief moment, her gaze met Howard's, and a small, soft smile touched her lips. Howard's heart hammered against his ribs, his palms suddenly damp. Maggie moved to the counter, ordered her coffee, and then, to Howard's surprise, she walked straight toward him. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Howard's throat went dry. He swallowed, his voice coming out rough and shaky. No, please, sit. Maggie set her coffee down, sliding into the chair. I've seen you here before, she said, her eyes warm and curious. Are you new in town? Howard nodded, his hands wrapped tightly around the mug to keep them from shaking. Yes, just moved in a few blocks away. Maggie nodded, leaning back in her chair. I live nearby too. Been here for years. It's a good neighborhood. Howard nodded again, his mind scrambling for something, anything, to say. But the words felt heavy, stuck somewhere deep in his chest. Maggie tilted her head, studying him. You seem familiar, she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. Did you used to work in auto repair? Howard blinked, a small, surprised laugh escaping his lips. Yeah, Finch Auto. Ran it for 30 years. Maggie's face lit up. I knew it. You fixed my car once. A blue Pontiac. You saved me a fortune. Howard chuckled, the sound rough and rusty. I remember that car. It was a real piece of work. Maggie laughed, her eyes sparkling. You said that back then too. Howard's chest loosened, the tension melting away. For the first time in what felt like years, he felt seen. Not as an old man, not as someone's father or a burden. Just as himself. Howard Finch, the mechanic who once fixed a blue Pontiac and made a stranger laugh. And in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost everything after all. Howard Finch sat across from Maggie, the empty coffee cups between them a silent testament to how much time had passed. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a pale, watery sunlight filtered through the window, casting soft golden hues across the table. Maggie leaned back, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. So, she said, her eyes meeting Howard's. You moved out of your son's house. That's a big step. Howard swallowed, the words heavy in his throat. Yeah, he said, his voice rough. I guess I couldn't take it anymore. Being there, feeling like I was in the way. Maggie nodded, her expression soft but serious. I get it. When my husband passed, my daughter insisted I move in with her. Said it would be good for me, but it just felt like I was invisible. Howard's jaw clenched, his eyes drifting to the window. Yeah, that's exactly it. Like I was a ghost in my own life. Maggie's hand reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was brief, but it sent a warmth through Howard's chest. A warmth he hadn't felt in years. The coffee shop had emptied out, and the barista was wiping down tables, stacking chairs, preparing to close. Howard and Maggie remained where they were, their conversation flowing easily now, like water finally breaking through a dam. Maggie told Howard about her husband, Tom, how he had been a big, loud man with a booming laugh and a heart too soft for his own good. How he had been gone for 6 years now, leaving a silence in the house that still echoed. Howard told Maggie about June, how she loved to dance in the kitchen while making Sunday pancakes, how she sang off-key to every song on the radio, how she had slipped away one winter night, her hand cold and still in his. It's funny, Maggie said, her eyes distant. We spend our whole lives building a life with someone, thinking that's what defines us. And then they're gone, and suddenly, we're just untethered, floating. Howard nodded, his throat tight. Yeah, and you keep thinking they're just in the other room, that if you turn around fast enough, you'll see them standing there. Maggie's eyes glistened, and she looked away, blinking rapidly. But they're not, she whispered. And you're still here. The barista approached, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're closing soon." Maggie straightened, reaching for her bag. "Of course. We should go." Howard stood, his knees protesting, his heart heavy. "Maggie," he said, his voice soft. Would you like to come back tomorrow? Maybe sit with me again?" Maggie's lips curved into a gentle smile. "I'd like that." Howard nodded, his heart pounding. "Good. Me too." Maggie adjusted her coat, her scarf tucked around her neck. "Take care, Howard." "You too, Maggie." She gave him one last smile before stepping out into the fading light, her silver hair catching the last rays of the setting sun. Howard watched her walk away, the soft sway of her coat, the way she held herself, strong, steady, grounded. When she disappeared around the corner, Howard finally exhaled, the breath leaving him in a rush. That night, Howard returned to his apartment, the room still cold and empty. But it didn't feel as heavy as it had before. There was still a lingering warmth. Maggie's voice, her laughter, the touch of her hand on his. Howard sat down in the old recliner, the springs groaning beneath him. He glanced at the framed photograph of June on the table. The glass reflected the dim light, her eyes sparkling just as they had on their wedding day. "I met someone today," Howard said, his voice echoing in the empty room. She's nice. Real nice. She listens. She understands." Howard leaned back, his eyes closing. For the first time since he had moved into this apartment, he felt a sense of calm settle over him, a sense of belonging. Maybe he hadn't lost everything. Maybe there was still a life to live, even at 80. The next morning, Howard woke up early. The sun was just starting to rise, the light filtering through the blinds in soft golden slivers. He got dressed, put on his old leather jacket, and made his way to the coffee shop. When he arrived, the place was empty. The barista wasn't even there yet. But Howard didn't mind. He took his usual seat by the window, hands folded on the table, eyes watching the street outside. The world was waking up, cars humming by, people hurrying to work, the scent of fresh coffee wafting from the bakery next door. Howard felt the tightness in his chest ease, his shoulders relaxing. There was a calmness now, a stillness that he hadn't felt in years. And then the door chimed, and Maggie walked in. She saw Howard immediately, her face lighting up in a warm, familiar smile. "Morning," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Been here long?" Howard shook his head, a small, shy smile forming on his lips. "Not long, just waiting." Maggie set her cup down, her hands wrapped around the mug. "Me too," she said softly. "Me too." They sat in silence for a moment, the world outside moving on, the coffee shop slowly filling with people. But in that small, warm bubble of space, it was just Howard and Maggie, two people who had lost so much, but were slowly, carefully finding something new. Howard leaned back in his chair, eyes on Maggie, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something close to hope. Maybe he hadn't lost everything. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to find himself. And this time, he wouldn't let it slip away.